As far as the Islamist tradition is concerned, AKP is very hegemonic, and Erdogan is, it's definitely that he has, in my opinion, at this point, established a full equation of party and leader. At this point, AKP is Erdogan, and Erdogan is AKP.
A sort of authoritarian form of neoliberalism. An authoritarian form of neoliberalism. An authoritarian form of neoliberalism.
It's a fake term anyway.
Sorry, can I come in? No, sorry, I was just making a face at me.
Guys, come in. It's good. Let's be excellent. Let's be the greatest.
Hey, welcome back to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. What comes next? In last week's episode, we visited Colombia, where the right unfortunately held on in a general election. Today we're talking about Turkey, where the right held on in a general election. Erdogan's coalition held on to an absolute majority against a new oppositional alliance of secularists and Islamists. But pay attention, this isn't just another tale of conservative stability. Turkey's been in turmoil from 2013 onwards, and developments there are not only of regional importance, but illuminates many of the key trends in politics today, from identity politics to the new authoritarianism. And the key political figure there seems to embody so many global political trajectories. Erdogan might not be just another Oriental strongman, but actually be of a piece with Western developments. So first off, you're going to hear the regular Alpha Bunga Bunga crew outlining some key points of interest. Then we're dialing up Yasemin Yilmaz, an expert in Turkish political economy, currently doing a PhD in sociology at the Grad Center at City University of New York. We'll close up, as usual, by seeing if we can't generalize some of what we've learned. Alright, hello listener. This is Alex Hochuli here in São Paulo, Brazil. I've also got Ben Fogel with me in São Paulo, Brazil. We have George Hoare in London and Phil Conliffe in Canterbury in the UK. All four of us are here to discuss Turkey. As you heard in the introduction, there's been an election. It's another election in which, maybe not the most exciting outcome happened. The right held on and won. So I guess the interesting thing is to try to chart out what the lessons are to draw from this. George, do you have any thoughts? Did you follow this election?
Yeah, well, I guess what I'm really looking forward to hearing about is a little bit of the context, because I think you get a pretty one-dimensional picture from a lot of the Anglophone media. So a little bit of the history of the AKP, the personal background of Yilmaz Erdogan as well. So yeah, I guess putting it into a little bit more of a detailed picture, and something also about the role of the left as well, how that fits in. Yeah, and I guess if you were to dumbly follow the kind of mainstream Western media narrative on Turkey, you would have for a long time, for about a decade or more, have been thinking, yeah, this Erdogan guy is good. He's like a good economic competent manager, and he kind of maybe is doing a kind of version of Christian democracy in Turkey, like a kind of center-right moderate Islamist thing. And we're okay with that. And then suddenly he's this nasty authoritarian.
I've actually been following Turkey for some years now, since I was there in 2015. And I've read quite a bit about Turkish history and recent Turkish politics. But it's quite clear one of the most remarkable things about the AKP's time in power, and that's Erdogan's party, is that it's transformed so many times. It's been in bed with everyone from a organization of sort of like secretive religious Freemason type Gulenists that try to take over the state from it, to the nationalist right. It is the Islamist party has always been, at odds with. And furthermore, he's gone in bed from the sort of Bush Axis of Evil alliance to Putin and rejoined the sort of axis of evil. He's shown a remarkable capacity for change. And I think what's really important in this episode, is to get a sense of what are the economic and political dynamics that go beyond the sort of like excess of voluntarism on his part.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. And we're going to dial up Yasemin Yilmaz right now to talk to her a bit more about these issues.
Welcome to the show. Let's start off with talking about the most recent events in Turkey, which is, of course, last week's elections. There was a presidential and general election in Turkey, which saw Erdogan, the current Turkish president, and his AKP party and its coalition emerge victorious. This was despite there being a lot of talk in the Anglophone media, particularly in The Guardian, The New York Times, about how this might be the demise of Erdogan's coalition and the beginning of the end for the Turkish leader. Can you just outline what exactly happened in these elections and why they happened in the way they did?
Okay, hi. And so going into the elections, the anticipation was that the signs of an economic crisis were starting to manifest themselves, and the opposition for the first time in over a decade seemed to be running with viable candidates who could both attract voters from the opposing base and also consolidate their own voters. So this, the wave of optimism, it really stemmed from the fact that this was just possible, not that it was probable. In that context, the election results didn't confirm these expectations, though Erdogan's party, AKP, lost about 7% of the vote compared to the last elections in November 2015. The widespread anticipation of a big downfall in the nationalist vote, the smaller coalition partners, so to speak, of Erdogan's, all analysts were anticipating something like 5 to 6% for the nationalists. When they were able to with the results, they were able to consolidate their previously held 11%. So Erdogan was able to retain his control over both the presidency. He was re-elected president, and he still has a majority in the parliament.
Turkey has been in political turmoil since more or less 2013. We've had Gezi, economic downturn, terrorist attacks, the war in Syria, the attempted coup, and the repression that followed. Personally, what has this been like? What has it been like living in this context of people losing their jobs for political reasons, planes flying over during a attempted coup, terrorist attacks, people being arrested that you may know, and of course the sort of consolidation of Erdogan as a empowered authoritarian leader?
So I've only been living in. I was living in Turkey for only 1 year of this, which was probably the most chaotic one, between June 2015, when Erdogan for the first time lost his grip in the parliament, to the aftermath of the coup until August 2016, and it is chaotic to say the least. But life in Turkey, I guess, has been chaotic for most of us for a very long time. So
I guess from outside, it seemed like Turkey was in a greater period of stability from around the turn of the century until about 2013. And then things started happening and things started kind of falling apart, and Erdogan started gaining greater control, sometimes through democratic means, sometimes not. I mean, has this been felt in Turkey? Is this something that people have? Yeah.
Of course. I mean, so Erdogan actually came into power in the aftermath of the biggest economic crisis in modern Turkish history. And at that point, Erdogan's first 7 to 8 years can actually be read more as a period of stabilization and normalization rather than Turkey making a more democratic or advancement type move, because his what was prior to him was also even more anti-democratic in so many other terms, especially in terms of
Can you
the
just
Turkish
break down who was prior to Erdogan?
So it was a series of coalitions, basically a combination permutation game between 5 parties for over 15, 20 years. So coalitions were not able to stay in power, either because of internal divisions or because of various economic or socio-political factors. But it is essentially, since the early 80s, Turkish political and economic life had been very unstable and very conflict-prone. And especially the state's primary method of dealing with the Kurdish conflict in the east was to impose stricter security measures to deepen the war and to exacerbate the situation. So when Erdogan and his AKP came into power in 2002, it was on the tail end of a 20-year period like this. So the first 7 to 8 years of AKP is seen as normal in comparison to what had preceded it. But after 2007, 2008, with the onset of the global financial crisis, the domestic political and economic situation in Turkey also started to change a little. With the aftermath of the great 2008, 2007, 2008 recession in the West, the markets, the credit markets, and the domestic economic situation in Turkey also started to be not as favorable to Erdogan as it had been. With that kind of tightening came the 2013 threshold. That is when the state's security policies had also begun to revert back to what it was in the 90s. The economy was contracting for the first time in Erdogan's tenure, and you had widespread protests beginning in Istanbul with the Gezi Park, then spreading to the rest of the country, culminating in what had Erdogan's been main method of attracting voters, which is to consolidate votes based on identity politics, to create a division of like us versus them, headscarves versus the secularists, that kind of polarization.
I just wanted to jump in. Just if you could explain a bit more, this is Philip, by the way, just if you could explain a bit more, what do you mean about identity politics in the Turkish context and the kind of identity politics that the AKP would deploy?
Okay, so identity politics in the Turkish context means something different than it does in the West. But when we use the term, we basically mean Erdogan's tenure in office has been consolidated on the backbone of a secularist state, repressing moderate to radical Islam for decades. And this could be in terms of banning certain sects or banning certain establishments, to outlawing women from wearing headscarves in the public office, to women attending colleges with headscarves. So there had been a real base for this kind of divided society to speak of. And Erdogan's tenure has been one that basically said to his electorate that if I go personally, or if my party goes, your headscarf is now going to be up for debate once again. You are not going to be able to attend university once again. But because this is the elitist, Kemalist, secularist mindset, if they ever get back into power, this kind of moderate Islam that has now made its way into daily economic life and daily social life will again have to retreat back to its closed quarters. So that's what we basically mean when we say identity politics. Political parties have also been confined to these kinds of particular identities, where it's the AKP to the headscarf, the families who wear the headscarf, or the Kurdish party to predominantly Kurdish voters, or the CHP to predominantly metropolitan, urban, and secularist people. So it is this kind of consolidation and polarization is what we mean by identity politics.
Alex has a question here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to delve a little bit deeper into this, what is the sort of social base of the AKP, and where does it draw the support from? So if it plays this sort of, I guess sort of conservative, maybe sort of populist card, in the sense that, as you described, the Kemalist elite are going to try to take your headscarf away. Who does that appeal to? And maybe regionally in Turkey, who does that appeal to?
So regionally, Erdogan, AKP is the only party that can attract votes from all the regions in the country. This is not the case for any of the other parties. But that's also a function of the fact that it has 50% of the vote. Naturally, it has some sort of presence throughout the country. But predominantly speaking, for those familiar with Turkey's geography, what we call central to center-eastern Anatolia is its primary base of support. So mostly confined to towns, smaller cities, rural areas. It also has big presence in the metropoles, of course, but that's also, as I said, a function of the fact that the party has 50% votes nationally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and I mean, I guess to carry on, and to broaden it out. So, I mean, in this recent election, obviously the AKP was victorious, but it relied on certain allies. And as my understanding so far is that Erdogan has tried to draw in new sort of allies, which might be a little bit different from the sort of AKP's original sort of base and ideology, perhaps in a more nationalist direction. Is that correct?
So, yes, but this has been the case since the attempted coup the AKP had been even before the attempted coup, the AKP had been moving more towards the nationalist and more traditional nationalist is what we could call it, line. And the coup attempt and its aftermath really consolidated this kind of alliance. And the constitution referendum of last year, both parties again ran as a formal alliance, ran the Yes camp as a formal alliance, and this time they entered the elections together with Erdogan as their joint presidential candidate. This is untraditional for the Islamist heritage, you can say, but AKP has basically grown through a series of what we call mergers and acquisitions within the right. So Erdogan has allied with right liberals, even left liberals at some point, all the various shades of center-right politics, going to more radical Islamist elements to more moderate Islamist elements. It has been Erdogan's strategy to hold on to power and to consolidate his own rule. To basically, he does these kinds of what could seem as untraditional alliances within the right, and he has essentially subsumed the entire right spectrum on the AKP.
And on the opposition to the AKP, it seems like there was another curious thing that happened during this election where you saw the secular opposition centered around the CHP get into bed with the religious opposition, who were traditionally mortal enemies. Is it the case that his power has bred strange bedfellows, and the same sort of process has been happening there?
Exactly. I mean, the alliance was a very innovative move on the part of the opposition, one that Erdogan probably did not see coming, and that because of the constitutional amendments, the 10% electoral threshold is basically rendered irrelevant to formal alliances prior to elections. So basically, instead of having coalitions and coalition talks after the election, parties now enter into formal alliances prior to the election, which renders the 10% electoral threshold obsolete. That was the context in which the radical Islamist Felicity Party entered into the alliance. Theirs was an alliance theirs was not so much of an ideological alliance, but a practical one between the CHP, the Islamist Felicity Party, which turned out to be an irrelevant force politically. The anticipation was that they would be able to attract the religious, devout, and vote who's unhappy with the AKP, and also two parties of the center to the nationalists, right? Which also sound way below expectations.
Hi, Yasemin. This is Philip again. I wanted just to jump in on this point. So liberals for a very long time have portrayed Turkey as a successful example of a secular Muslim democracy. And now with the consolidation of Erdogan's power and the long-term domination of the AKP, it would seem to confirm, from the outside, it would appear to confirm all the worst kind of concerns about whether or not democracy can spread outside the West, or whether or not democracy is compatible with Islam, and all those usual kind of themes. So I wondered if you could maybe just tell us a bit about life in Turkey, I suppose. Does it feel more kind of socially conservative under the AKP? Has there been more visible expression of religion in public? Or do you think that there is perhaps a backlash developing against the AKP's religious and social conservatism?
So the anticipation in the West of Erdogan and the AKP being this sort of liberal, religious Islamist, but yet secular and modern party and that this could be the way for it to make Islam and democracy compatible. The fallacy in that thinking was in thinking Erdogan and AKP as being forces for democracy. For Erdogan and AKP, the democracy and democratic means have always been purely instrumental and to be upheld only insofar as it served their particular interests at particular points of time. But I personally don't think Erdogan had at any point let go of his vision for a more firmly religious, more firmly Sunni state and society. And in that respect, throughout the years, as he was able to consolidate power, he has chipped away at what were previously deemed secular privileges, I guess, in Turkey, whether it be from shortening times of wholesale alcohol, of the whole, what's the phrase, the sale of wholesale alcohol?
Yeah, that's correct.
I guess. To various other, not eating outside during Ramadan in smaller cities in central Anatolia was always difficult, but at this point it is now unthinkable. So there has definitely been a move socially and culturally towards more religiosity and more conservatism, and on top of this, Erdogan has revived this soul of late Ottoman period, and now the Ottoman symbols and even from TV shows, you can see that there's a TV show after another about depicting one life of a sultan after another.
So just to jump in here again, what is Erdogan's final goal? What is the goal of the AKP? Is it to create a new sultanate? What is it?
I personally think it's to consolidate a firmly religious and socially conservative state, not one like, not a formal theocracy by any standard, but a formally modern state that has very strong religious and conservative overtones and practices in its daily life. He definitely has some ambitions towards greater influence within the region. Whether he'll succeed at that or not is a different question that has other determinants besides his own political capacity. But domestically, his project seems to be intact and on its way.
So, I mean, in terms of his project, I mean, I guess if we're trying to look at ways in which Erdogan might be challenged, what are the kind of fissures that might be emerging? I mean, he's had to, of course, in this recent election, rely on a coalition, rely on the nationalists more. And I mean, as you say, this is a project of creating hegemony for himself of hegemonizing right-wing forces in Turkey. Is there, what cracks might we see? I mean, is there sections of the elite perhaps, or the religious right, or the Kemalist elite who might be starting to challenge Erdogan or break with him?
So for whatever challenge that is to come, for that to be sustainable and actually effective, it would have to come from its mass base. And the fissures there are very prevalent. There's been about 120% increase in the price of everything from onions to potatoes, basic household consumption items. The price of meat per kilo has gone through the roof. Now almost unthinkable for any family with minimum wage to be able to purchase a kilo of meat once a month.
And is there evidence of this so far that these economic difficulties are putting pressure on the AKP and Erdogan?
So the evidence seems to be, and this is at this point purely preliminary at this point. We'll see what's to come. But the fact that there has been a 7% drop in Erdogan's votes in very key cities, traditionally Erdogan's very strongholds, there has been a move from AKP to MHP. And one columnist a couple of days ago noted that there is this tendency of the electorate to, whenever they're unhappy with the ruling coalition, they tend to go the nationalist MHP. So this does suggest, just even on the surface, that Erdogan's base and Erdogan's electorate is seeing signs of dismay and seeing signs of unrest, but they're not yet ready to break ties with the party or break ties with the ruling coalition. So their way of voting for MHP meant keeping Erdogan in power, so keeping, so to speak, the captain of the ship in place, but significantly altering the chain of command, so to speak.
George has a question here. George, can you come in?
Yeah, so just I guess some questions maybe about the left and the opposition more generally. So I guess one of the big questions is if many of the HDP, the main left party, many of the leaders have been the victims of political repression and are currently behind bars. How is it possible to be active on the left in the current moment in Turkey?
Well, certainly the fact that most of the HDP's leadership, and not just the leadership, but also its rover cadres organizing at the neighborhood level or at the city level, they're that has a crippling effect on the trajectory of organizing. But this is not something new for anyone who's been organizing on the left, or especially for the Kurds in Turkey. So I guess on that front, you can say that there's nothing new under the sun. This is difficult for sure, and the fact that HDP was able to still amass almost 12% of the vote is significant. But the way forward, it seems that there seems to be a big economic crisis approaching Turkey, and there's various scenarios as to how this is going to be managed or experienced, and all roads seem to be leading to some sort of IMF-type plan, whether it's with the IMF or without the IMF. The basic tenets are going to be the same, and this is going to disproportionately place the burden on the laboring and working masses. And the strategy forward seems to be organizing for that, organizing in anticipation of that. There are local elections coming up in 9 months, and the big cities, the big metropolitan municipalities of Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, these are very important resources for any political movement. That, in my opinion, is a strategy for the left for pushing forward.
I wanted to push you a little bit more on the question of labour. What has the AKP's rule over the past 16 years and its sort of form of sort of political economic management, what kind of transformations has that led to in Turkish society? What has been the role of labour? Have there been any changes in labour relations? Because you've mentioned sort of strikes and so on. I wanted to know also a little bit about that.
So AKP has pushed through a very aggressive neoliberal agenda with very minimal social conflict, and this has really been the star of its the star in its record, especially as far as the West was concerned. The first 5 to 6 years of the AKP was a very aggressive IMF program pushed through without virtually no mass uprising against it. And in that, it has really crippled labor, and it has really pacified labor. But over the past few years, with the economic contractions now coming in, labor is starting to flex its muscles again. We are seeing very limited but sure signs of this. But the main issue facing labor right now is that since the attempted coup attempts with the martial law in place, the government has powers to outlaw any strikes based on the fact that it's a threat to national security. And Erdogan has been bragging about this at every business roundtable, at every business dinner or lunch he attends. He actually mockingly turns to the industrialists and says, "Why are you unhappy with martial law? This is very good for you," and it is actually very good for them. It's working very well for them. That's the primary challenge facing any labor organization at this point.
How does this relate to the Kurdish question? What is it in the status of the left of the Kurdish question in terms of the recent Turkish politics?
So the Kurdish question seems to be on hold in a sense. The government has relinquished all intent of negotiating with the PKK or the HDP, or negotiating with the PKK through HDP. There seems to be no new rounds of negotiations or peacemaking on the table. The level of conflict has been relatively low over the past year. I guess not past year, but the past 6 months, you can say the level of conflict within Turkish borders has been relatively low. The Turkish state is still engaged in attacks and airborne attacks on Kandil and areas of Kurdish dominance in Syria. So the more of the focus of both organizations, of both the state and the PKK, seems to be focusing on Syria at this point.
And finally, can you, just to end off the interview, can you just give us a little bit of a Turkey's leader's personal biography? He has had an interesting life and many incarnations throughout the years. And he also has a particularly troublesome brood, from what I understand. His family has been quite controversial and involved in a number of scandals. Yes.
Yeah. So Erdogan comes from youth organizing, from student organizing of the late 70s, and from the Islamist tradition. He actually was a semi-professional soccer player at some point, and had he gone that route, maybe all of our lives would have been different. But he didn't.
Football saves lives.
Yes, so he stayed in politics, and he rose through the ranks of the Islamist movement, and he was mayor of Istanbul at a very early point in his career in the early 90s, was imprisoned, and upon his release from prison, he was already very popular prior to his 6 months stay in prison. But once he was out, there was really no force containing him, and he and a group of others from the traditional Islamist movement at that point led what was called the new wave type movement and established the AKP. And AKP came, as I said, on the back of this big economic crisis when all the other parties of the center, both left and right, were crushed. And Erdogan has not only gotten rid of his political enemies from opposing forces, but he's also gotten rid of his contenders from within his own party. And by getting rid of, I mean just making them politically irrelevant and politically not a force to be contended with. So Erdogan's transformation over the years has not only been one from a activist, low-level participant in a wider political movement to a single man ruling over an entire party, and now what's ruling over the entire right, the entire Islamist movement, which is what this last election has shown. When the other contending Islamist party got only 1% of the vote, this means that as far as the Islamist tradition is concerned, AKP is very hegemonic, and Erdogan is, it's definitely that he has, in my opinion, at this point, established a full equation of party and leader. At this point, AKP is Erdogan, and Erdogan is AKP. And in terms of his family life, he's also gotten significantly richer through this, through his tenure as prime minister and president. And his family, I guess what you were alluding to, Ben, is that one of his sons was actually involved in a car crash leading to the death of a singer, and early in Erdogan's career, and he's very far from the public eye. And the other one seems to be dealing with all these corruption and bribery. The other one seems to be taking care of all that kind of stuff. And the son-in-law is what Erdogan is sort of raising to be his successor politically.
So do you think it's accurate to describe them as fail sons, some of his brood? Because this is a
so I actually don't know what fail sons means.
It just means, I guess, the useless sons of political leaders around the world.
Yes, I guess you could call them that, yeah. The daughters and the son-in-law are definitely much more capable.
So in terms of his international allies, which I think you mentioned briefly, could you expand on that a little bit? Who's he looked to ally with internationally?
Well, Erdogan is a very pragmatic leader. I don't think he views alliances at all in an ideological or principle line. If it's Merkel that he needs to ally with, he'll ally with Merkel. If it's Putin, he'll ally with Putin. In that kind of, that's how he was able to consolidate the right in Turkey, and that's how he seems to be sustaining his tenure in the West as well.
All right, thanks to Yasemin Yilmaz, who we were just talking to there about the state of affairs in Turkey. To draw out some broader conclusions, as we like to do at the end of the interview. At the end of the interview, we were talking about Erdogan and a bit of his own personal history, but I think it'd be interesting to pull out what we think about Erdogan and what he might represent as a political figure of our times. He is said by some to represent an authoritarian form of neoliberalism. You might put him in the same camp as Putin in Russia or Modi in India. But I think what's also interesting is that he seems to not just be authoritarian, but increasingly rely on social conservatism. So like Putin in Russia, who relies on Orthodox Christianity to bolster his rule, or Modi in India, which is obviously Hindu nationalist. This seems to me, and this is an open question to you guys, this seems to be a long way from the sort of sunny liberalism of Blair and Clinton, for example. Philip, any thoughts on this?
I think he does represent a kind of model of an autocratic new model of political change, I suppose, and also expresses, I suppose, the tensions and the tightening of all the problems that we're seeing around the world since the 2008 crisis. I suppose the thing is, though, the very fact that we're talking about it, I think, also goes to show how much things have changed maybe over the last 10, 20 years. The very fact, I mean, just the sheer fact of Turkey's significance, it's a much more important country, given by its kind of demographic and economic weight and its political role in the Middle East. And I think that probably matters as well, that a lot of the trends and things that we're talking about reflect a world order in which more and more countries are more important by virtue of all the global economic growth and globalization that we've seen over the last 30 years.
I mean, is it a change of packaging? So, Alex, you mentioned the sunny liberalism of Blair and Clinton. I mean, there's been countless books written on how they also had various forms of social conservatism, but maybe just packaged it in a slightly more upbeat, friendly way.
Yeah, and
sorry, that was a question. I didn't lilt my voice, but that's I mean, is it a question of? I mean, is this just a new packaging with a bit more of a multipolar global situation, as Phil mentioned, rather than a fundamental change in neoliberalism?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's two things, I guess. One, that you're right at pointing out that, Blair and Clinton did have authoritarian tendencies, sometimes did rely on more social conservative policies. I mean, if we were to roll back a little bit further in the history of neoliberalism and power, obviously Thatcher and Reagan were much more obviously socially conservative. And it was only at the end of the Cold War when you had this breakout of a more maybe sunny sort of version of it. But I guess that's a strain that's always been there in neoliberalism, a sort of authoritarian and socially conservative tendency. But I guess the other thing, and I'm going to come to Ben here, is that this might also be something of the global semi-periphery, that in maybe the kind of core capitalist nations, you could maintain a more liberal neoliberalism, if you want to call it that, whereas in the semi-periphery, it has had to be more nakedly authoritarian.
I had some thoughts about this, and particularly after having been in Europe for a few weeks and having many conversations about nationalism there, which seems to be an extremely dirty word. People hear it and they just turn their brains off. In that globalization was presumed in the classic end of history narrative to be a sort of fertilizing ground for sowing the seeds of liberal pluralistic values. But in some sense it has done the opposite, by the removal of political alternatives, whether it be the left or some forms of sort of secular nationalism with some sort of developmentalist aspects as were common across the semi-periphery. It has instead sowed the seeds of authoritarian turn in different places, in the sense that when people basically see no alternative to adopt some sort of free market things, what do you have as a alternative but to go back to the sort of classic tropes of authoritarianism and differentiating people in the sense. And in this case, it also relies as portraying this as some sort of like anti-elite thing. In the case of Turkey, it's the sort of, snobby, secular types who live in Istanbul and see themselves as orientating more towards Europe. In the same sense, it was the sort of elite who lives in coastal cities in the United States who believe so firmly in these sort of values that are essentially a form of, I guess, political virtue signaling. We are better than them without having to build an inclusive political program because, there is no alternative to the existing order. And I think part of the desperation that you see, and it's utter desperation. I mean, reading The Guardian, an always painful experience, really shows this, is that people are like, and we've talked about this in previous episodes, everything is okay right now. It would be the most happy, richest, prosperous, and egalitarian time in history. But if that's the case, why does almost no one, especially among people who do not offer this sort of shiny internationalist existence that we can fly across the world and enjoy the fruits of our passports, feel this way?
I like the fruits of our passports. That's a good coin. But no, I think you're right. And it's interesting to see that dynamic between sort of well-to-do metropolitan types who are kind of fairly comfortable with the current situation and a sort of a resurgent right, which in real practical terms doesn't offer much different in policy terms, but at least in terms of in maybe kind of cultural terms, and certainly in its authoritarianism, kind of distinguishes itself from the more, I guess, centrism, as we'd call it we'd call it sort of in Britain and America. In Turkey, it obviously it comes under different terms.
I mean, I think Turkey is a great example. Istanbul, which is a real global megacity with a metro area of 18 million, and which has a country classic semi-peripheral problem where there's one urban center or a few urban centers that pull people from the countryside and are by economic compulsion and are thrown into this jarring way of life. In these cases of sort of urban crises where rarely the sort of moral development that's championed by the AKP in Istanbul is sort of like soulless Gulf-style apartment blocks. You see the same in cities like Cairo. What they're going to do, they can play to identity politics. They can play to signaling things about headscarves and ways of sort of like saying, at least we include you in the order, which was sort of a classic theme of populism. We be one of you. And in this case, it's sort of like throwing easy shots at, alcohol-loving secular elites who felt that Istanbul was theirs. And this sort of like cultural battle in the urban centers is also a big part of this new wave of politics. And I think if you do a quick tour across sort of megacities like this, you find many of the same tropes, including Toronto, where Doug Ford won the same thing with a base among immigrants, including lots of Muslim Somali immigrants.
So as you heard Ben concluding just then, there's some general trends we identify in really different situations in places shaped by totally different histories. This is actually what we do here at Alpha Bunga Bunga, charting the breakdown of the neoliberal order. We alternate between specific country analyses and episodes looking at big ideas. What are the ideologies shaping our time? And can we plot a new political spectrum that will order future struggles? If you don't follow us on Twitter and like what we do, check us out at Alpha Bunga Bunga, that's all in one word. And get in touch on Facebook, email, Twitter, or even on Instagram. Many of you recently have got in touch with great ideas for topics you think we really need to be covering, and it's greatly appreciated. We'll be doing those soon. We're also adding readings to the show notes, as lots of you have requested it. And we're back with more soon. In the meantime, tell your friends about the podcast at the end of history. Catch you later. Bye-bye.